Episode 6: How to Build Your Own Life Without Breaking the Family. Hello, I'm Alexander von der Fen, and this is the Next Gen Mentor podcast. This series is for you if you're growing up around family wealth, not because you choose it, but because it was always there in the background, something you were aware of, even if it did not fully concern you yet. You may be still at a distance from it, or you may already feel it starting to move closer. Either way, at some point, it becomes real. What I'm sharing here comes from a series of conversations that I had over a few months with someone in exactly your position. The questions she asked me are often the same ones people think about, but rarely say out loud. Last time, we spoke about the system you're part of, how it works, and what it means to begin finding your place within it. Today, we take a step further. Because at some point, understanding isn't enough. You have to start making decisions. And that's where things become less clear. I don't really understand what I'm supposed to do yet. How do I even start making the right decisions? That's a familiar place to be. We often think that clarity comes first, that at some time things will fall into place, that you will see the path and that you will then follow it. Sadly, life rarely works like that. What tends to happen instead is much simpler. There are periods in our lives where things seem to align, where what is available to us fits naturally with what we're trying to do. We don't have to force it. It just works. And then there are other moments where it doesn't, where what's expected of us feels slightly off, or where the direction we're moving in doesn't feel obviously connected to the family system at all. I've seen people like you hesitate at exactly that point, not because they lack ability, but because it's the first moment where they realize that the system will not decide everything for them. This is where independence begins to take shape, not as a grand statement, but as small decisions. For example, do you accept something because it's there or because you're ready for it? Do you continue with something that feels like yours, even if it delays your involvement? Do you show up everywhere or only when and where you can genuinely contribute? Do you say yes quickly, too quickly, or do you take a step back and think? At the time, these decisions don't feel particularly significant, but over time they begin to form a pattern. And that pattern becomes visible, not just to you, but to others as well. Wouldn't it be easier then if I just stepped away from this all for now? I've seen two mistakes come up quite regularly in families like yours. One is stepping away completely. The other is being drawn in too quickly. Neither tends to work particularly well. The difficulty is holding both at the same time. There are periods in your life where stepping back could well be the right decision, not as a rejection of the family system, but because you just need space to build something that you feel is yours, to see how you operate when your family name isn't doing the work. That experience matters far more than it may seem at first. Because it's one thing to make decisions within a system that supports you, where you have a home advantage, so to speak. It's another one entirely to make them when the outcome depends entirely on you. You learn different things in those moments: how you think, how you judge situations, how you follow through when there's no structure around you. But there are also moments where stepping in becomes necessary, where your absence is noted, where decisions are being made that you need to understand, even if you're not yet leading them. And the challenge is that there's no fixed rule for this. It just shifts at different stages in your life, in different situations, and at different moments. So what you're really developing here, what we're talking about, is not a principle that we can apply every time. It's the judgment to decide when to do so. And judgment takes time to form. What if I don't actually know what I want to build yet? You may be happy to hear that that is far more common than it may seem. In fact, if you were completely certain about things at this stage, I would be slightly worried. The fact is, most people don't know. And the reason is not a lack of direction. It's that the environment around you already provides a direction. Quite convincingly, in fact. After all, there are ready-made roles available. paths that have been followed before, opportunities that arrive early to you because of who you are, sometimes even before you have had to define anything for yourself. I've seen it happen quite a few times. A next gen member steps into a role in their family system that looks right, not because they're flattered to have been asked. It fits, and it makes sense to everyone around them. But a few years later, you've got a strange sense of, well, discomfort. Not because the decision was obviously wrong, but because it was never fully yours. And once you're inside something like that, I can tell you, it can be difficult to adjust course or even get out. So the first step in building your own life is not necessarily separation, it's clarity. And clarity in this context is as much about elimination as it is about definition. So, a more useful question might actually be this: what are you building that would still make sense if the family system just wasn't there? If none of this existed, none of the money, would you still move in that direction? That question tends to simplify things rather quickly. Not completely, of course, but enough to start seeing more clearly, and it usually requires a certain amount of distance. Now, I'm not talking about stepping away entirely from your family, but just getting enough space to think without immediately reacting to what is available to you. That can feel uncomfortable, of course, even slightly unproductive. A few years ago, I had a conversation where someone exactly your age said quite directly, I feel like I'm somehow wasting time by not committing properly to my family office. In reality, they were doing something important. They were allowing themselves to think clearly before committing. And that changes the quality of what comes next. Without that space, something negative can happen. You can begin to move in response to what exists rather than move towards something that you have chosen. Now, at first, you may barely notice the difference, but over time, it shapes everything. The reason is that once you begin to see your own direction more clearly, your whole relationship with your family system changes. You will become more selective, more deliberate. You're no longer asking where you fit, you're actually asking where you can add value. And that is an entirely different thing. One is about finding your place, the other is about defining your role. And roles built that way tend to be far more stable because they're grounded in something that actually exists independently, not outside the system, but alongside it. And that's where your independence begins to take a more solid form. How does decide when to say yes and when to say no without getting it wrong? Okay, so now this is where things become more visible. Not because you've suddenly got some clear certainty, but because your decisions are now beginning to follow a pattern. You're no longer simply reacting, you're choosing, and that changes how your involvement is seen. Over time, people will begin to notice something. You're not present everywhere, of course, but you are present where it matters. And when you are there, it's clear that you chose to be there. That carries a lot of weight. This does, however, require something that's not always comfortable. You have to be able to say no. You have to be able to do it without over explaining. But when you begin to be more selective, it can be misunderstood, at least initially. The interesting thing is, however, that over time something becomes clearer. When you do engage, it is deliberate, not automatic, and that in fact changes how others respond to you. It also introduces a different kind of discipline. Once you choose to step into something, you need to contribute. You can't just rely on the structure to carry you. And when you choose not to step in, you need to be absolutely comfortable with what that means as well. That's where judgment becomes more demanding. Not just deciding what to do, but deciding what not to do and being at ease with both. What if everything seems to happen at the wrong time? Yep, that tends to be the case in life. After all, life has its own sequence: education, early career, settling down. Your family system has a different one, but it's still a sequence: meetings, decisions, moments where involvement becomes necessary, and the two systems rarely align neatly. You may be asked to step in just as you're building something of your own, or feel the need to step back just as expectations are increasing. There is sadly no clear transition point, no moment where one phase ends and the other begins, and that's what makes this stage difficult. Success is not only about what you choose, it's also about when you choose it. Because there will be moments where stepping back feels a lot easier, where stepping forward would require effort, preparation, and a certain exposure. And there will be other moments where stepping forward feels premature, where you are not entirely ready, where the risk of getting something wrong is really quite visible. Neither situation has a perfect answer, but avoiding both tends to lead to the same outcome, very little progress. So part of this is accepting that timing will rarely be ideal. What matters more is that it's considered. You step in when you can contribute something meaningful, and you step back when you cannot. And over time, that creates a rhythm, one that others begin to understand and eventually even rely on. How do I know if I'm doing something because I want to do it or because people expect me to? Now, this is where things become a little more subtle. Up to now, you've been looking at your relationship with your family system. But there is another layer to this, your relationship with expectation. And that is not always easy to see clearly. There are external expectations, what others assume you will do, how quickly you will step in, and what role you will take on. Nevertheless, in many ways, it's the internal expectations that are more demanding. What you think you should be doing, what you believe others expect of you, what you feel you need to prove. Those pressures do tend to be less strident, but they are somehow stronger. I've seen people adjust their decisions without even realizing why. Not because something was clearly required of them, but because they somehow felt that it was expected. And over time, that can shift your direction in ways that are really difficult to notice at first. So, this is where independence is tested in a different way, not in what you do, but in how you decide. Let me explain. A good example is, can you recognize when you are moving because it feels expected and when you're moving because it's actually the right thing to do? Now, that distinction is not always obvious, but it does matter. After all, if most of your decisions are shaped by expectation, your independence will always remain something at best fragile. It can be influenced, redirected, eroded. Whereas decisions that are grounded in your own judgment tend to hold, even when they're not immediately understood. That doesn't mean ignoring expectations altogether, of course. They're there for a reason, after all. Often they reflect something real, a need within the system and a responsibility that exists, whether or not it has been fully expressed. But they need to be considered, not simply followed. And that requires a certain level of confidence. Not confidence in being right, but confidence in how you come to decisions. That you have taken the time to understand situations, that you have thought about where you can contribute, and that you're acting from that place. There's also something else that begins to emerge at this stage. Your decisions do not happen in isolation. They affect other people, even when you're not intending them to. So whilst independence is personal, its impact is anything but. It's shared. If you move too far too quickly, it can create a sense of instability. If you stay close too long, it can create a different kind of dependency. Neither is what we're aiming for here. And this is where communication becomes important. Not in the sense of explaining everything in detail, but at least in the sense of making your direction visible. I mean by that you should let people understand the intention behind what you're doing so that your decisions are not misinterpreted. Because when there's no explanation, people tend to fill the space themselves. They assume. An assumption, famously, is the mother of all failures. An assumption will emerge that you're disengaged or uncertain or just not willing to step in. And the problem with assumptions is that once they settle and solidify, they influence how others will respond to you. So part of building your own life, everything we're talking about, is not just deciding what to do, it's also making sure that others understand, at least broadly, why you're doing it, not as a justification, but as context, so that your independence is seen as something deliberate, not accidental. There's also a more practical side to this, which becomes clearer over time. And that's that independence requires some sort of structure, not the structure of the family system, but your own structure. How you organize your time, how you approach decisions, and how you follow through on what you commit to. Without that, something tends to happen. You may have clarity, but it doesn't translate into action. That's where many people struggle. You see, independence is often associated in people's minds with freedom, the ability to choose or to move in your own direction. But freedom without structure is chaos, and it leads to drift, not progress. So part of building your own life is creating something within you that holds you in place, not rigidly, but reliably. A way of working that allows you to move forward consistently, to assess your opportunities properly, and to follow through on what you say will do. I know this may sound kind of operational, but it's not really. It's behavioral. And behavior repeated over and over again over time is exactly what shapes your trajectory. There's also the question of how you handle things when they don't go as planned, because believe me, they won't. In the army, we used to say that the first casualty of war is the plan. And that's true. You will make decisions that don't work, whether it's because the timing is off or you will have taken the decision on the basis of bad information. That's just part of the process. And in a system where your visibility increases over time, those moments are pretty much always seen, not always commented on, but still noticed. What tends to matter then is not the mistake itself, but how you respond to it. Do you adjust? Do you withdraw? Do you take ownership? Do you deflect? Do you move on? Independence is not about avoiding errors. It's also about how you deal with them. I don't know whether you've seen this movie, but there is a famous quote from the movie Rocky Balboa, where Sylvester Stallone's character is talking about winning in this way. You, me, or nobody's going to hit as hard as life. But it ain't about how hard you hit. It's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward, how much you can take and keep moving forward. You see, handled well, failures, falling down can become part of your development, but only if you get up after them and keep going. Handled poorly, they create uncertainty, both in yourself and how others engage with you. Over time, another shift begins to happen when you're independent, one that's less obvious at first, and that is that independence is not a fixed state. It evolves. At that point, the question changes. You're no longer deciding whether to engage. You're managing how you engage, how much of your direction you retain. And this is where earlier decisions begin to matter more. If you've taken the time to build something of your own, then this stage becomes more stable. You're less likely to be absorbed, more able to contribute without losing perspective. But if that foundation is not there, something else tends to happen. The system becomes more defining, not deliberately, but structurally, because it offers clarity, direction, and a defined role. And those things are difficult to step away from once they've taken hold, which is why the earlier stages matter not just as preparation, but as protection. They allow you to engage fully without becoming fully dependent. There's also something less visible that you need to maintain, and that is a certain distance. Of course, I'm not talking about physical distance. I mean some sort of mental distance. The ability to step back, even when you're closely involved in something, to observe what's happening objectively, to question it, and to reassess your own position within it. Without that, clarity gradually begins to fade. And once it fades, it's not always easy to recover. Everything can start to feel normal, given, and expected. And that's where independence can begin to erode. So maintaining that distance is not a rejection of the system. is in fact the very thing that allows you to remain effective, to contribute with some perspective and not just react. This is where the idea of independence settles into something far more practical. It's not a position, it's a way of operating. You're part of the family system. That doesn't change. After all, you contribute to it. That becomes necessary, but you also retain something that's yours, your direction, your judgment, and your ability to decide. That's what allows you to move within the family system without ever being fully defined by it. How do I make sure that independence doesn't damage my family relationships? This is something that only tends to become visible over time. As you begin to make more deliberate choices about your life, you will not be the only one adjusting. Others in the family system will need to adjust to you as well. You may notice small shifts in how people involve you, or in how they speak to you, or in what they assume about your availability or your priorities. If you build something outside them, people may begin to see you as more independent, but they may also involve you less. Now, don't misunderstand this. It's not because they're excluding you, but because they assume your focus is elsewhere. If you remain closely engaged, on the other hand, you may be included more often, but your role may also be defined more quickly, possibly before you've fully decided yourself what you want that role to be. Being independent does not just shape your path, it shapes how others position you within the system. And once those patterns begin to form, they tend to solidify and persist. So part of this process is not only deciding what you do, but noticing how those decisions are interpreted by other key players and adjusting where necessary. Not to control perception, but to ensure that it reflects your real intent. There's also the question of comparison. If you've got siblings, for example, different paths may be taken by different siblings, and some will engage with the family system earlier, while others will do it later. Some will build externally, while others will do it internally. And over time, those differences can lead to comparison. Who's more involved, who's progressing faster, or who is adding more value. And if you're not careful, comparisons will begin to influence your decisions. You may adjust your path, not because it's right for you, but because it aligns more closely with what others are doing, or what seems to be more recognized. And this is where independence also requires another kind of discipline, the ability to stay aligned with your own direction, even when others are moving differently, even when their path appears more visible or more immediately rewarded. Independence in this context is not rewarded in the short term. Sometimes it actually feels far less spectacular, less obvious, less acknowledged. But over time, the difference becomes clearer. Paths that are built deliberately tend to be more stable, more sustainable, and ultimately more useful to the family system itself. Before we close, let's bring this back to basics. Independence in your position is not a single decision, it's a pattern developed over time. It shows up in what you accept and in what you decline, in when you step forward and when you choose to step back. At the time, none of these decisions feels particularly significant, but over time, each one accumulates, and they begin to form something that others can see. A direction that is yours, still connected to the family you're part of, but not entirely defined by it. And that's what you're building. Not distance, not separation, but the ability to engage deliberately, to be present where you can contribute and to step back where you cannot. In both cases, without creating instability. Now, it takes time. Not because it's complicated, but because it requires consistency. And that's where most people drift, not in one decision, but in the accumulation of them. So for now, let's just keep it simple. Pay attention to the decisions you're making and ask yourself, are they deliberate or are they being made for you? Let's now list some takeaways from this episode. Things to do or avoid doing. First, things to do include taking time before committing to roles or opportunities. Number 2, building something that would stand on its own outside the family system. Number 3, being selective about where you show up and contribute. Number 4, making your intentions visible, if only briefly. And 5, developing your own structure for decisions and follow through. And things to avoid include saying yes too quickly because something is available. Number 2, stepping away entirely for too long. Number 3, letting expectations shape your direction. Number 4, trying to be present everywhere. Number 5, over-explaining your decisions just to gain approval. And that was this session where we looked at how to build your own life without breaking the family you're part of. In the next session, we will move into capability, into how decisions are actually made, and why understanding those changes will define how you engage entirely. Until then, I am Alexander von der Ven.